Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar with Wartsila Energy Storage and Zenobi, where we will be exploring the largest operational BESS project in Europe, the Black Hillock Battery Project, which went live in March this year. This webinar is affiliated with the Energy Storage Summit taking place on the 24th to the 25th of February in London next year. Over the past 10 years, the summit has been widely recognized as the meeting point for energy storage leaders and will bring together over 200 speakers and 2,000 attendees to discuss the path forward for energy storage in the UK, Europe, and beyond. Before we start, I'd just like to highlight the format for the session today. So our speakers won't be sharing any slides. However, they'll be facilitating a discussion for about 35 to 40 minutes, and thereafter the audience will have a chance to ask their questions. We will do our best to get all of these questions answered. If you do have questions, please make sure you put them in the chat in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Attendees have the option to upvote questions, and we will go to those questions first. So please do put your questions in throughout the discussion, and we'll get to them towards the end. So now I'd like to hand over to Caroline Wright, General Manager for Market Development in Europe with Wartsila Energy Storage, and she will introduce the webinar for us.
Thank you.
Hi, Caroline.
Thank you, Lucy. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Caroline Wright. I lead the strategic market development efforts across UK, Ireland and Europe at Wartsila Energy Storage. Together with our customers, we're driving the transition to 100% renewable energy future. Our portfolio includes advanced energy storage hardware, the intelligent controls and the optimization software right through to full life cycle services, all designed to seamlessly and safely integrate with complex power systems. So today, I'm thrilled to discuss the Black Hillock project in Scotland, alongside Steve and Duncan from Zenobi and my good colleague Scott. As you know, grid stability is essential for maintaining a consistent, reliable power supply. We will delve into how the battery storage system provides virtual grid services, particularly as the increase of the share of renewable sources in the power system and together with the phase out of traditional power sources. So no further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Steve, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Zenobi?
Sure thing. Thanks, Caroline. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Turner. I'm a Senior Business Development Manager at Zenobi. So my role is essentially working across the different functions at Zenobi to build out the business case for our investments, primarily taking projects through from the early development stages through to financial close when the construction can begin. I've been at Zenobi since 3 years ago and have worked on projects across the world. Prior to that, I spent 5 years at the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, or ARENA, which is a government renewable investment fund that invests in early stage pre-commercial renewable tech. At ARENA, I invested in a lot of the early stage Australian large battery projects, including the Hornsdale Power Reserve and many others that were trialling new grid forming inverters that were providing some of the stability services that we'll be talking about today. In terms of Zenobi, we're a battery storage specialist. We've got key businesses across electric buses, trucks, second life batteries, as well as large-scale utility batteries. So my team, the network infrastructure team, invests in and builds large-scale batteries to help keep the lights on as we transition to a renewables-dominated system. So we have over 1.1 gigawatts of batteries at the moment that are either operational or under construction in the UK. I think where Zenobi differentiates ourselves is in the use of grid forming inverters to provide these services, namely kind of inertia and short circuit. And we're currently the only battery provider in the UK that actively provides inertia to the grid through our Black Hillock project. And I'll hand over to Duncan for his introduction.
Thanks, Steve. Hi everyone. My name's Duncan Hughes. I'm head of the engineering team within the network infrastructure business in Zenobi, which is the side of the business that focuses on our grid scale battery projects. My team looks across the whole life cycle of the project, from early stages of development right through to detailed design, where we work with our suppliers. Talk a bit more about how we worked with Wartsila on that later on. And then right through to the operations phase, the projects as well, where we're actually looking at how they're performing. Are they doing what they're meant to? Are they providing the grid with the right services that we'd hoped? So yeah, we get to see the whole project from start to finish. I've been with Snowbie around 2.5 years now. My majority of my previous career was spent with National Grid, doing primarily sort of transmission planning, regulatory work as well, justifying why some of the major reinforcements to the grid were needed. So that sort of gave me quite a good insight into how the grid was changing, what sort of challenges it was facing, and then how companies like Zenobē could then act to help those and help mitigate those challenges in a way that was more cost effective for consumers.
Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Blaylock. I am the general manager of the integrated application engineering team with Wartsila Energy Storage. My team's responsible for really the whole delivery and life cycle stages of projects with regards to controls, SCADA interfacing, and networking. We work on systems around the world. I'm based on the East Coast of the United States. I've been with Wartsila for 5 years working in energy storage, and prior to that, I have about 13 years in the energy industry, primarily in kind of traditional thermal and nuclear generation. I guess I'll go ahead and kick off the discussion with kind of an overview of BESS in general. Everybody that's joined this webinar, I imagine that you know kind of what a BESS is, but we'd like to start kind of from the basics just to make sure we set the context. So when we talk about a BESS, we're talking about a grid scale system that's going to have several, 5 to maybe 100 or more inverters, and these inverters are going to connect to battery systems. There's various chemistries that are used in grid scale batteries, but the most common is lithium ion. And those inverters are going to convert that DC energy into AC power. And then that is going to connect to the grid. And generally, we're talking 20 to 200 megawatts for a single system. But as we know, they're getting bigger every day. So that's generally what a BESS is. But what kind of BESS do and why do we need it is ever evolving. So the initial base use case is energy shifting. So you have intermittent renewables, solar during the day, obviously has most of the power generated. And then at night, little or no energy. So the battery allows you to store that extra energy while generation is high and demand is low, so that you can then discharge that energy later on in the day. So that's kind of where we started with batteries on the grid. But as we found more use cases for batteries, we found that they're really like a Swiss Army knife. They can stack these different use cases of not just energy shifting, but also responding to deviations in frequency, providing reactive power support to kind of stabilize voltage, being able to participate in different frequency regulation markets. And as we're talking about here in this webinar, now we're seeing more use for inertia and short circuit contribution, which are almost instantaneous responses to different variations in the grid. And now I'd like to hand it over to Duncan. See, Duncan, if you could kind of go into what makes Black Hillock a unique project and kind of an overview of what we've done there.
Yeah, no problem, Scott. Yeah, cheers. So yeah, quick overview of the project then. So Black Hillock, it's a 200 megawatt capacity 2-hour site, which means 400 megawatt hour of sort of energy capacity in the site. Given the scale there at 200 megawatts, we are connected to the transmission system. So we're connected to SSE's transmission network up in the north of Scotland at their Black Hillock substation, which is a 275 kilovolt substation. The battery at Black Hillock, often people talk about battery projects. It can be sometimes hard to visualize. So handily, we've got the picture there, but behind us that you can see in the screen. For context though, round about 9 acres, sort of 5 football pitches in size, so pretty big, proper grid scale, sort of power station size asset, this one. Our battery site is actually around about 1 kilometre away from the SSE transmission substation. So we connect to that substation via an underground 275 kV cable between the two sites. Construction on this project commenced in February 2023. Construction works and sort of connection to the grid was completed in November last year, 2024. And then full commercial operations starting in March this year, so once it was fully commissioned. So quite a good, quick build program, certainly, quicker than, traditional large sort of synchronous power stations. So, showing how we can be responsive and getting these things delivered quickly where the need is, in this case, which is up at Blackhillock for NESO. So we delivered this project in partnership with a number of suppliers. Zenobē tends to use multiple suppliers to different aspects of the project. With Wartsila, they were obviously supplying the key part of the project was the battery energy storage system, and acting as an integrator to bring all that together for us. The inverters, which we'll come on to talk about, which are a key part of the battery system, that they were provided by SMA through Wartsila. So we had a very good working relationship with the 3 parties there in bringing that project together. As Steve sort of said earlier, our role as Zenobē is we bring these projects together, we fund them, we deliver them, and then we own and operate them. We'll talk a bit more about how it does this, but to give you an idea of some of the benefits that a system like this can give the consumer, we reckon over the 15-year sort of initial lifespan of this project, we could save consumers around about £170 million through more effective, sort of allowing more effective operation of the grid and sort of maximising the usage of renewables. Also, potential reduction in CO2 emissions, around about 2.6 million tonnes over that period as well, which obviously is a massive saving from that as well. So yeah, that's a quick overview of what the project is. I think we'll come on later to talk a bit more about the interesting stuff it does and how it does it. But I'd like to hand over to Steve now, who'll be able to talk through what was it in the market that drove us towards developing this project, why did we develop it where it was, and why is it providing the services that it does.
Thanks, Duncan. I think conceptually, we're moving from a system that's dominated by large centralized thermal generators. And when these generators, the way they generate electricity is through a spinning turbine. And so all these kind of turbines are basically spinning on the network and responding to fluctuations in the level of demand. And through doing that, they can essentially balance the system between supply and demand. As we move to a more renewables-based system, that sort of natural inertia that gets provided by thermal generators starts to reduce, and we essentially need to find other ways of providing those services. So what this Blackhillock project does, it essentially provides it finds a mathematical way of providing that inertia and replacing what is typically provided from thermal generators. And this enables us to essentially not have as many gas turbines running, but still retain a lot of the stability. So essentially we're burning less fuel and sort of saving consumers money and also burning less carbon. In terms of other aspects on why this project is valuable, it's located up in the northern tip of Scotland, where there tends to be a lot of wind and not a lot of demand. So you have these long periods of time where there's an excess in renewable energy generation and not actually enough transmission capacity to sort of move that power down south to where the load is predominantly located down south. So Blackhillock, by being up here, we can actually charge when there's too much wind, and when that constraint is lessened, we can then discharge and provide energy when it's needed. So this enables us to essentially contribute to the stability of the system, but also make it more efficient by unlocking the value of constraints. In terms of how this project was unlocked, It was through a program called the Stability Pathfinder program, which is a great example of NESO as the system operator of the UK being quite forward thinking and realizing as the network evolves, we need to evolve in how we respond to and provide the system, keep the system operating. Essentially, it's kicked off in 2019, and there's been 3 rounds of this Stability Pathfinder program where NESO has been determining how do they replace the services through these technology neutral tenders. I think the one that's relevant to Black Hillock was the second Stability Pathfinder, which was trying to find solutions to the lack of short circuit level in Scotland. I won't go into the details of what that means. I'll leave that to Duncan and Scott later. But essentially, Black Hillock bid into that tender back in 2022 and was able to secure a contract, which was really a kind of a leading. I think NESO really established itself as the sort of the leading system operator by creating a market for these new services and establishing these products. I might just pause there and see if Caroline wanted to sort of jump in with any further comments around the sort of the market context for the UK.
Yeah, I think you've summarised it really well, Stephen, and I think it's a great example where the structure and getting it right. I think the UK, in terms of NESO's approach to this, is I think pioneering. It's a step change in proving what battery storage can do. I think if you look across other markets, because in my team we cover European markets and global markets, I think there's a similar issue and need across these other markets. You've got high levels of renewable penetration. You've got not necessarily the grid looking at how that can be balanced through other services, and then also how those services are actually implemented and incentivized for projects like this to be built. I think obviously everybody's very aware of what's happened in Spain. This is happening globally, and we've seen it in other global markets as well. So I think what we can see here is where the UK has got it right, and I think it's a good case it's a great footprint for other grids and markets to look into and understand how it can be designed, implemented, and with commercial value. So the likes of these projects can actually, these services can add to the revenue stack. And I think it's another way to illustrate, I love the word, the Swiss Army knife. It's another level of service to the grid, which is a need, but also adding to the commercial, so to that revenue stack, with other, so being able to stack it with other services as well. So, yeah, I think this is where we could see these types of programs evolve. The challenge is when other markets, it's whether the grids or the government can incentivize it and structure it to build that in. So I think that's where time will tell, and that's where our team, that's what we monitor and look at in terms of where those market needs are.
Yeah, and I think the UK has been kind of really great as the leader in creating these services, and you're starting to see some of the European systems follow suit. So Germany announced a few months ago that they're also going to be introducing an inertia market, which I think is kind of a really great step for them. I think my home country of Australia has been a real technical leader, and I think the first large grid scale battery with grid forming and inertia services was located in Australia back in 2017. So it really goes to show that sort of forward thinking. But I guess where they haven't backed it up is coming up with those sort of structured incentives and market frameworks for procuring inertia. So even though they've got all these batteries that they've tested and have commissioned and providing and sort of able to provide these services, they haven't backed it up with here's how we're going to do it, here's the rules, here's how many batteries we want to be doing it, and that just sort of muddies the water a little bit. So it sort of really goes to show that policymakers, if they provide that consistent framework, it can lead to a more kind of thorough and systematic replacement of these services such as inertia.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think if you look at in terms of cost, there's obviously, in terms of balance, there's an intrinsic cost, which inevitably goes to the consumer. I think in terms of the balancing, I think in Q1 this year, I think over 200 million spent on curtailment, which I think adds up to about 3 billion annual cost towards the end of the decade. So with those costs, those costs have got to be soaked up somewhere. And I think the Pathfinder with it is a great example of how a structured approach with a good commercial case can start to soak up those costs, which will reduce that impact on the end consumer as well. So
yeah, I think it's a really important point to highlight how much inertia can save consumers, because when you don't have enough inertia on the network, essentially what NESO have to do in the UK is turn off cheaper wind and pay that wind to turn off. So that they're still paying for the wind generation that's not being used. They then have to turn on gas generators down in the south to basically be spinning and providing that inertia. So all that is a significant cost to the market and consumers. And by sort of replacing these inertia services, you can basically cut constraint costs by a significant amount.
yeah, absolutely. I think there's probably a good springboard maybe for Duncan and Scott to go into a bit more of a deep dive. Perhaps I can hand it over to you guys.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to maybe take a step back and explain a little bit more about what we mean when we're talking about inertia. That's probably the word we've used the most today so far. But to kind of reframe the problem that we're facing with the way that energy has been generated for more than a century now, is mostly been generating steam to spin a turbine, and the turbine is a big mass of metal. There's a lot of kinetic energy stored in that turbine as it's spinning. There's also a lot of thermal mass in the overall thermal generation, so that the power is not instantaneous. It's a little bit slow to ramp up and ramp down, minutes or hours, which is both good and bad. The bad part of it is you can't react to a sharp change on the grid quickly. But the good side of it is you have inertia. So if that generating unit trips offline, the turbine doesn't just stop immediately. It keeps spinning. It keeps providing some inertia to the overall system. To the contrary, with an inverter-based resource, which when we talk about solar, wind, battery, these are all inverter-based resources. They are much quicker. Again, good and bad. The good side, they can respond within milliseconds. So like within a quarter of a second, go to full power. That's very good when you're controlling it properly. But the bad part of that is it does not have that inherent inertia, which means if it goes offline, it's an immediate drop of that power. So as the overall composition of the grid shifts more towards renewable, that becomes a problem that we have to address, and that's what we're addressing here. And the way that a grid forming inverter addresses this is essentially by having an even faster response that is based on the rate of change of frequency. So as the frequency drops sharply, the inertia power contribution increases. And as the rate of change slows down, that power decreases. Traditionally, our frequency response markets are based on like the absolute value of frequency. So they measure the frequency, it's 49.8. That means I need to give X amount of power. But with inertia, it's more about how fast the frequency is changing. So if the frequency is 49.8, but it's stable, no inertia response. But if it's 49.9, but dropping very quickly, we're going to inject a lot of power very quickly to try and slow down that rate of change and essentially try to catch the grid before it causes a domino effect of tripping offline transmission assets and other generating units. So Duncan, is there anything you wanted to add about maybe more deep dive into how Black Hillock is addressing inertia?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we sort of covered a fair bit of like what inertia is, why it's important there in terms of being able to have an operable grid going forward. So I think this is going to become more and more of a key technology. I guess for us, one of the sort of technical challenges was how do we take that technology of grid forming inverters plus batteries and turn that into a commercial project that Zenobē as a business would want to deliver, and that could sort of maximize the benefits for both the network operator and ourselves as a developer. So in doing that, there was quite a number of sort of technical challenges and opportunities as well, because although a grid forming inverter can be to some extent as a kind of off-the-shelf product, what we did working with yourselves with Wartsila and SMA as well is really sort of see how we could push that off-the-shelf product and use it in a way that was really going to deliver the best possible product for the consumer. So we sort of did that by looking at how could we size the project, how could we use the inherent, say, overload capability of the inverters such that all those services we're talking about, like inertia, things like that, can be delivered simultaneously and without reduction into the capabilities of the other aspects of the battery. You mentioned earlier, Scott, I think the Swiss Army knife type thing. So what we sort of mean by that is at any one time, the battery system as a whole can be poised to provide a whole range of system services as is whatever is needed by the grid at that point of time. So you might be able to see, for example, a rock-off event you mentioned where the frequency changes very quickly. You will see an initial inertia response out of the battery to help arrest that frequency change. That will sort of happen in the kind of millisecond time scale. You will then start to see the next sort of services come in, like the traditional frequency response services, start responding to that to help the network kind of recover as well. At the same time as all this is going on, the system could have been providing reactive power sort of support to the network as well. We could have been trading or absorbing energy prior to the fault as well. And none of those will influence the other sort of provision of the service. So it's able to do a huge amount at any given time. And the reason of doing that is that allows those individual services to be priced at a rate that is attractive for NESO and is best value for the consumer, compared to, say, a more traditional solution to sort of providing inertia in the system, things like synchronous compensators, things like that. We can provide it much more cheaply, that service to NESO, because we're also able to leverage sort of revenue from all the different services the battery can do. So probably one of the key things, and Scott, you might be able to add a bit more to this, that let us do that, is the what we call the power plant controller that sort of sits on top of it. So the grid forming nature of the inverters is a kind of inherent characteristic of that technology type. But how we put that all together with the battery system and all the other services comes from the power plant controller, the GEM system, which Wartsila put together. So we did a lot of work with Wartsila in understanding what we wanted the system to do, how we wanted to do it, what the grid code required, and then that system sort of put all that together. So Scott, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how that challenge was for you guys on that side of actually putting that together.
Yeah, I love talking about GEMs. So with inertia, Duncan, you mentioned it, you touched on it, but the response for inertia is honestly, it's so fast that it's physically impossible for a power plant controller to calculate that response. I mean, we're talking less than 10 milliseconds. It's done responding before we could even send a signal to the inverter. So the inertial response is handled by the grid forming inverter, but then orchestrating everything else that we've been talking about, the frequency response markets, the energy markets, any number of other services that are being provided, any other maintenance that may be going on other parts of the plant. That's all orchestrated by the power plant controller. And that was the main challenge of this project from a control standpoint. And through close collaboration with SMA, modeling teams on both sides, doing a lot of studies of how the controls will interact with each other, especially during these Rokoff events where the inverter is generating some grid forming response. How does the power plant controller monitor that behavior and compensate for it essentially, or not compensate for it when necessary, while still providing all of the other traditional services like the dynamic regulation and moderation and containment services. There's a complicated dance of a lot of different moving pieces. And one other thing I thought that we could touch on is that this plant, being one of the largest in operation in Europe, so we said it's 200 megawatts, but it's actually split up into four separate 50 megawatt BMUs. So I don't know if Stephen or Duncan, you wanted to kind of expand on that a little bit of how that is registered, or how does that play into how the plant is operated?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So yeah, exactly as you say, Scott, split it up into 450 megawatt balance mechanism units. They're all individually registered as independent BMUs. The benefit that gives us is that can let us sort of trade and place the plant commercially in a way that can be most sort of optimum. So we could have one BMU poised to provide a certain type of frequency response service. The next one can be bid into a different market. So you're still providing a whole host of services to NESO, but you're able to sort of cover all your bases commercially as well and make sure we're sort of optimizing both the services we provide and the and also the sort of economics of it. I'd say from a technical perspective, this again was one of the sort of big interesting challenges we had with this. Again, this was a bit of an uncommon way of doing this. So we were layering another kind of level of innovation and kind of new approach on with the project. What that sort of meant was, as well as the development work that had to be done between ourselves, Wartsila, there was quite a lot of work to be done with NESO as well to get them comfortable that this was going to do everything that it said it would, and also that we were sort of providing these commercial services as we said we would. I think there was a bit of a concern that when we say stacking, what actually in reality might have been seen from the plant was maybe a single change in power output, and we are trying to claim that that's actually 5 different services, whereas NESO might say we're paying you 5 times. So there was a lot of sort of simulation and modelling work that was done, and we were able to sort of prove and demonstrate to NESO that you could see those individual services happening in the different time frames, and that the response was distinct, and each one was sort of the full level of response you would expect from something providing that service individually. But that was a lot of work, a lot of collaborative work between us, Wartsila, and NESO. I think it was a good learning process for everyone. I think sort of NESO showed their commitment there to looking to get this new sort of stuff onto the network, getting it kind of doing everything we hoped it would be able to do from day one, which I think was a really big achievement. It could have been a case where we perhaps connected and then worried about trying to build this stacking on, but we went for it, and we've been successful in getting it all operating right from the start. It's really good. I was going to say fortunately, maybe fortunately is the wrong word, but there have been a couple of fairly major system events that have happened since the plant commissioned, which actually gave us the opportunity to see how it was behaving and see the inertia response, but also then the sort of subsequent stacking of services. So that's been really valuable to us, and also helped sort of validate all the simulation and modelling work that was done with NESO. And actually, we were all pretty confident that it is sort of behaving as we hoped it would, which was really nice to see. I was kind of crossing my fingers for when the first big event might come and making sure it behaved itself. So that was really good.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing about the split BMUs, which we call multi-tenant, where you have each of these BMUs as a tenant. is the reactive power side of things. So they do still share one interconnect into the grid, which means that the reactive power, voltage support, really all of the grid compliance functionalities, they are evaluated as one single plant. So while we have the 4 different kind of commercial units, we are still treated as one plant on the grid interconnect. So the power plant controller is controlling the reactive power. Generally, that's going to be voltage support at like as one overall plant, while simultaneously allowing really the real power for each of those BMUs to be traded in the different services individually.
I guess, Scott, having been through this process with NISO and sort of getting the project approved to provide all these sort of services and this quite innovative way of operating the plant split up in this way, what would you say kind of key learnings for that are, and how that could be transferred to maybe like other countries, other networks that might be sort of looking to solve similar grid problems?
Yeah, I think it's obviously it's a good proving out the concept that virtual inertia does what the manufacturers say it's going to do. I think what an initial or what a grid utility or country can do really varies on where they are right now. If they don't have much battery, but they have a lot of renewables, just adding batteries, period, is going to help. Being able to kind of ride through the intermittency of renewables is going to improve the stability of their grid, and really moving towards a more dispatchable resource when you add a battery to a solar or a wind farm. Obviously, we're talking about inertia. So inertia is for a grid that has a decent amount of batteries already, being able to implement inertia where possible. And it is also locational. Short circuit contribution is even more locational, which really depends on where a fault happens or where the short circuit level is low in a grid. So picking the right location to put in these advanced grid forming inverters is a very important consideration. And yeah, I think just keeping in mind that batteries are kind of the way to increase the resiliency and reliability of the increasing renewable generation that's being put on, installed around the world.
There was one question I see that's coming in the Q&A. It was something I meant to mention a minute ago, so I'll very quickly answer that one if it's okay. So someone had asked the question about how does the sort of megawatt and energy capacity of the site interact with the inertia services we provide, and do we need to kind of keep back or reserve some of our headroom away from maybe standard trading to allow us to provide those services? So the answer to that is no. When I was saying earlier about the way we sort of sized the plant and optimized it and looked at the overload capabilities we could leverage in it, it's been done such that even when the plant is operating at, say, maximum import or export levels against its rated megawatts of 200, it will still provide all the inertia that we are contracted to provide under our SP2 service, even at those sort of max output levels. And that's done by sort of exploiting the inherent kind of overload capabilities that exist within the inverters. So yeah, we were very keen not to restrict our sort of trading opportunities in order to provide these services. And what we were able to ultimately land on design is something that lets us have our cake and eat it, if you like, when it comes to the technical support we're providing to NISO and flexibility for us within the market.
I was actually going to see if I could pose a question to Caroline and Stephen. So how have you seen other jurisdictions looking at unlocking the value of batteries from like a market standpoint?
Did you want to go first? I can maybe.
Yeah, I think the German example is good. I think Germany, in terms of their plans for battery storage, are around you can always try and draw similarities between markets. But in terms of the way the market's structured in Germany, you've got high volatility in the market in terms of wholesale trading, day ahead, intraday trading. And I think with the systems, the way they're looking at the system services, the capacity market, they'll be coming online, and then they're actually addressing inertia now. Germany is no different than really any other market globally. You know, you've got high levels of wind and solar. They're probably one of the earlier adopters of roof-based solar, did that way back in the day. Yeah, I think that's where they've understood that there is a need. And I think the key thing which the Inertia is addressing is that it's more than a nice to have, although some of it can be described as pioneering experimental. It's actually what the grid needs now. We're moving from sort of like traditional spinning reserve into more virtual synthetic inertia. And I think where governments and legislation and the policymakers are moving is the forward-thinking ones are now starting to address that. So I think as we move forwards, where you see footprints like what we're doing in the UK, like I mentioned before, I think if those governments and grid operators, TSOs, start to sort of look how they can map that into their grid, I think we could start to see a pattern happening around Europe, but and globally as well. My focus is more in Europe. Yeah, Stephen, I don't know whether you've got any other points to add on that, because you've got great experience, obviously, with the Australian market as well, which...
Yeah, I think the Australian market's been really interesting. I guess where a lot of the action has been is in South Australia, which is one of the individual states of the national electricity market. And it's quite a small system, but it's a very heavy dominated wind and solar system. I think it's generally at about 70% renewables. And the rooftop solar can sometimes get well above the demand. So you have these periods of time where the renewables penetration is incredibly high. The way they've gone about it is they've bilaterally contracted with batteries to be able to provide frequency services as well as inertia. And sort of worked quite a lot with Arena, my former employee, to sort of test out and prove out new ways of batteries to provide these services. They've definitely gone with a relatively conservative approach of still using some spinning mass. So they have procured some synchronous condensers to sort of balance that need for SCL and kind of inertia. But they have also been quite forward-thinking in, we can't be spinning these things all the time. It's going to be very expensive if we need that. So they've been quite open to batteries and looking at how they can use batteries to provide and replace these services.
Yeah, that's a great example. And then just to put it into context and turn back to the Stability Pathfinder, I think there were the contracts secured were 35 JVAs in total across all of the inertia tenders. What percentage of that is battery providing out of that total inertia contracted supply services?
So it's the batteries are providing 5 GVAs out of the 35, so it's about sort of 14%. The remainder are mostly either synchronous condensers or pumped hydro and gas plants that are sort of spinning to essentially provide the same service. What we do expect and hope to see is that percentage of batteries come up, and that's expected to provide great services. Currently, the cheapest inertia on the grid in the UK is batteries. So it really kind of goes to show that because of the ability for batteries to stack these services on top of each other, providing wholesale trading, balancing mechanism, frequency servers, and inertia, they can essentially provide those services at a much cheaper price than kind of a sync-on alone, which can only really provide a couple services.
Yeah. I think when we'd been speaking before, there was, in terms of, we talked about the savings. Is it right in saying that the expected savings from Pathfinder 2 in total is about circa 500 million? So quite significant savings there.
Yeah, pretty significant, 500 million. I think when they've done the modeling for the third Stability Pathfinder, it was even higher at some multiple. It might have been over 10 billion or something like that over the 10 years. I think that was probably because it was priced during the during the gas crisis of 2022, 2023, which I think then highlights the advantages of being able to provide inertia with batteries. Is you essentially kind of take the price away from being linked to commodities and more to sort of a technology price, which, as we know, batteries are continuing to come down in cost. So the cost of these essential system services will only come down more.
Yeah, that's great. I think one thing that always springs to mind with all of this is the data. There's a mass of data that comes from battery storage projects in general. But Scott, I don't know whether you've got any sort of thoughts, but one question I had was whether you can answer it, Duncan, as well, is can we share any insight of how NESO are using that data to sort of either forward look or predict or gain that data to see how the asset is actually performing? I know you mentioned it in the early part of your conversation, but there's a massive amount of data that's produced from these projects, that produced from us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're probably still at the stage where they are using the data to understand how the site behaves. How, is it doing what we expected it to do? How does it respond to different events of different sort of severity on the network? So we have been sharing a lot of data from NESO. We have very sort of accurate monitoring of the plant, so they can really dig in and look at those response events and incredibly short timescales in which they happen. At the moment, it seems like things are all sort of behaving as they should be. We have found some interesting things where the inertia response of it does interact, not necessarily with the characteristic of like the other frequency services we might provide, but it does interact with the way NESO's current processes work in terms of assessing and commercially settling those other services. So we've had to work with the NESO team to make some sort of changes into those processes to make sure that grid forming plant is not being unfairly penalised, for example, because the inertia response is being seen as some sort of anomaly within that performance assessment. So I think it remains very much a sort of learning process, which is it's very interesting. It's probably the upside and downside of being sort of first to market with something like this. We are sort of figuring it out as we go. It's probably involved quite a bit more work for I think all of us involved in the project than perhaps we understood when we started it. Certainly compared to a normal, even sort of grid following battery connection. But I think, again, to be honest, that sort of puts a bit into perspective what the kind of level of achievement was in getting this sort of site fully operational in timescales that we did, because there was a very significant amount of firsts that were sort of achieved in that. And I think, the ongoing sort of work with NESO to continue looking at the site, how it's behaving, and then also refining now the codes and processes that support these projects going forward will be, that'll be an ongoing piece of work.
Absolutely. Just looking, there's quite a lot of questions coming in. Should we?
Yeah, I can generally answer. There were some questions related to kind of how would you actually go about adding inertia? So I think in a broader sense, one of the key things that we've been kind of touching on with ABES is that they can help future-proof. So, and that really comes down to grid forming versus grid following inverters, and this really depends on like inverter manufacturers. You're going to see different ways of handling it, but in general, when you're planning out ABES, thinking about what it might need to do in the future is always important, and that may drive the decision of, do you use grid following or do you use grid forming, even if maybe in the market that you're going to connect to and participate in, maybe it doesn't have grid forming services yet. But I think as we're seeing, it's very likely that it's going to become more popular. So accounting for that and kind of future-proofing a plant. As for an existing plant that is currently grid following, again, that kind of depends on the hardware you have, but my understanding is generally it is mostly something that can be retrofit, but there's a lot to consider. It completely changes the behavior of the plant. So like Duncan was mentioning, and as part of the learning process, if you look at a grid following plants all day, and then you look at a grid forming plant, it's going to inherently respond differently. It's going to not just follow exactly what it's being told to do. It's making more decisions on its own, in a sense, to respond to how the grid is. It's kind of more of a fluid response. So when it comes to modeling a plant, if you've gone through some amount of like approval process with modeling, you can't just switch to grid forming, and just move on, because the plant's going to be completely different. So the way that it behaves in the wider network is going to be different, and that is typically going to require like studies and modeling evaluation to see how that's going to affect the wider network.
Yeah, I'm just think if we go through and sort of pick through some of the questions, I think on that thread, is any more sort of like technical questions? There's some good ones in there for us, Stephen, on the markets.
One question I have for Duncan is how much cycling does for providing inertia require?
As in, like, how many?
Yeah, one of the question from Matt Watts was, can you share information on the throughput and the cycles per day related to providing virtual inertia? So I guess one part of it is how long is the response, and then another part is how often does it sort of get triggered and is required.
Yeah, so in terms of like sort of the overall cycling of the plant in terms of its discharge and sort of charging cycles, like inertia really has next to no effect on that sort of thing. It's happening in such short timescales and such short durations. It essentially has sort of zero impact on the energy capacity of the battery. So, you're not ever really in a position where you're having to we've had to provide inertia, so we need to recharge the battery. That's not really the sort of situation at all. So it's kind of independent from that. That would also get governed by the trading strategies and maybe some of the more longer term kind of frequency response services that the battery might be providing. In terms of like throughput, how often we see it, I guess that is entirely dependent on what's happening on the grid on any given day kind of thing. It will respond to the major events it sees when it sees a rate change of frequency that's sufficient to trigger the inertial response within the inverter. So that could be very regularly. It could be could be hardly ever, but for us, it doesn't sort of affect the other operations of the battery, which is again that kind of key thing to the stacking, that these things sort of can sit independently and give us maximum flexibility for the most amount of time. I think there was one, Steve, I don't know, maybe we hadn't made it clear. There was one asking about in terms of like revenue and funding for the project, what did the Pathfinder sort of contract we won do? It was asking whether it's did it cover the whole project, or is it just a sort of slice of the revenue? So I don't know, maybe you can talk on that a touch.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, it's more of a slice on the revenue. So you sort of layer it up, and most of your revenue is through your sort of wholesale and balancing mechanism, shifting energy from periods where there's too much renewables to periods without enough renewables. So that's sort of the bulk of your revenue. You also get additional revenue streams from the capacity market, which is essentially kind of a government market for firm dispatchable capacity in the UK. Then the remaining services, things like reactive power and inertia, tend to be a smaller slice. The Stability Pathfinder, though, has a very important it's an important value add, because as it's a contracted revenue, that makes kind of securing debt finance much easier, because you can sort of show the banks that the revenue I'm making isn't sort of contingent on volatile markets that are uncertain, and what is the gas price going to do, and what's going to happen in the sort of the weather patterns of the day. So it does enable you to sort of get more debt and basically lower the overall cost of the project through reducing the cost of the capital. I did another one maybe for you, Duncan, which was if you could comment on any of the kind of main construction challenges experienced by us during the build. I know it was a fairly challenging site from a topographical perspective, but it'd be interesting if you had kind of any comments on what were the kind of the key challenges.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there was the general challenge of working up in the north of Scotland over winter. So I know there's some pretty chilly days up there, if nothing else, and some days with heavy snow and things like that, wind, which just your sort of general construction challenges that you might face. We had some delays on both sides, both on our side and also on the grid connection side. Any other developers who might be listening into this, I'm sure will be very familiar with the delays that can sometimes pop up on the TO side. So that was kind of tricky for us. I think probably the biggest risk, if you like, that we faced in the sort of, if you want, the construction delivery phase, was towards the end when we were doing all that simulation work I described with NISO. A lot of that work needed to be approved before we were actually able to energize the plant, and that was where the real tension between the innovation and almost academic aspects of the project butted up against the commercial ones. We wanted to get the project on, get it live, get it making money. But at the same time, we were discussing some really quite deep sort of technical performance. I was going to say issues. They weren't issues. There were aspects with NISO where they were just seeking to sort of increase as much as possible their understanding of it. So I think that was certainly an interesting learning point, and probably one that we would hope to maybe improve or refine with NISO on our next project. So, for example, our Kilmarnock project that we're also doing with Wartsila, hoping to energize that later this year, another grid forming connection. We're hoping that some of those sort of technical queries, if you like, have now been sort of satisfied within NISO, and we can sort of get through that process a bit more smoothly. That was probably the biggest unknown, I think, when it came to the delivery stage.
That's great. Thanks, Duncan. I think time has flown. Some amazing questions coming as well. But I think to summarise, we've got about a minute left. I think we can clearly say that battery storage is innovating and reshaping the industry as it is today. I think this project and the Kilmarnock project are really pushing the boundaries on what battery storage can do. Taking a real step change. I think we've discussed everything from the technical aspects, some of the challenges, which has been really insightful, I think, and also I think where hardware and advanced software can help deliver that step change. And I think we're all sort of, in terms of the end view, is all achieving net zero in the UK, and where we're seeing the phase out of traditional generation. I think one question that came in, which is quite interesting, do we foresee the actual phase out of other spinning reserve or sources of inertia? That might be something we can answer after the seminar. But I think all round we can see the need there, and I think this is just the beginning of what battery storage can do in terms of inertia. So exciting times ahead. Really enjoyed this discussion. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you all for your insights. I think it was a very, very deep dive, but as always, we probably haven't been able to answer every single question. So what we will be doing is sending out the recording. So by the end of the week, you will have access to the recording if you do want to review it. And if you've got any follow-up questions or your question wasn't answered, then please do feel free to reach out to the Wartsila or Zenobē team, and I'm sure they'll be very happy to kind of go through it in more detail. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks to the panelists for your support and your time as well. And we look forward to seeing you hopefully in February. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks all.